Bridger Basin, Montana Territory, October 1879. When Jacob Reinhardt began stacking a second wall of logs around his newly built cabin, his neighbors gathered to watch what they assumed would be a spectacular waste of timber and effort. Some shook their heads. Others laughed outright. One seasoned homesteader called it the work of a man who'd lost his mind to mountain fever. But Jacob, a quiet German immigrant with calloused hands and precise movements, said nothing. He simply continued measuring, cutting, and fitting logs with the same meticulous care he'd shown building the inner wall. Between the two walls, he left a gap, exactly 8 inches of empty space that neighbors dismissed as dead air and dead money. What none of them understood, what Jacob had learned from brutal winters in the Harz Mountains, was that this wasted space would soon become the difference between survival and suffering when temperatures plunged to 30 below zero. Before we reveal what Jacob understood about heat retention that his critics missed, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. In return, I'll show you 3 more forgotten building techniques that can cut your heating costs by up to 60%, techniques that modern construction has completely abandoned. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how many of you are dealing with brutal winters right now. The question that haunted Bridger Basin that autumn was simple. Had Jacob Reinhardt discovered something revolutionary? Or had isolation finally broken his judgment? By February, everyone would have their answer. Jacob Reinhardt wasn't the kind of man who explained himself. At 43, he'd crossed an ocean, survived 2 harsh winters in a dugout shelter, and finally saved enough to claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act. When he began construction in late summer 1879, neighbors assumed he'd build like everyone else, a single-wall log cabin, chinked with mud and moss, heated by a stone fireplace. They assumed wrong. The first wall went up conventionally enough. White pine logs, each 10 to 12 inches in diameter, notched and stacked with workmanlike precision. Jacob selected each log personally, rejecting any with excessive taper or rot. He squared the interior faces with a broadaxe, creating flat surfaces that would hold heat more effectively than round logs. Then came the peculiarity that would define his reputation for months to come. Instead of finishing the exterior with simple chinking, Jacob began constructing a second wall, a complete outer shell of logs, each 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Between the 2 walls, he maintained a consistent gap of exactly 8 inches, using carefully measured spacer blocks he'd crafted from scrap lumber. Thomas Bradley, a carpenter from Pennsylvania who'd built 17 cabins in the valley, rode out to investigate. He found Jacob drilling small holes at the top and bottom of the wall cavity, for holes near the roofline, for near the foundation. Reinhardt, Bradley said, dismounting, "You're doubling your timber cost for what?" 8 inches of nothing. Jacob continued drilling, his auger bit chewing through pine with steady rhythm. Not nothing. Air. Air don't keep you warm. Trapped air does. Jacob withdrew the bit, blew sawdust from the hole. Still air. No convection. Bradley spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "I've built more cabins than you've seen winters, friend. That's 8 inches of wasted wood that could have gone to a barn or a second room. Come January, you'll be burning twice the firewood to heat twice the wall mass." Other neighbors shared Bradley's assessment. Michael O'Toole, who ran the nearest trading post 12 miles south, told customers that the Germans gone soft in the head. Even sympathetic voices suggested Jacob was applying European solutions to American problems, that Montana's dry cold was fundamentally different from whatever damp winters he'd endured back home. Jacob's response was always the same: silence and continued work. He completed the double wall structure by mid-November, just as the first serious snows arrived. The cabin stood peculiar among its neighbors, noticeably thicker, almost fortress-like, with those mysterious holes near the roof and foundation that Jacob refused to explain beyond saying they were for air movement. The betting at O'Toole's trading post ran heavily against him. Most figured Jacob would abandon the cabin by February and move in with someone sensible. A few thought he might survive, but would burn through his entire winter with supply by March. Nobody, not even Jacob's few defenders, predicted what actually happened. What Jacob Reinhardt understood, and what his critics completely missed, was a principle of thermodynamics that wouldn't be formally studied in American building science for another 30 years: the insulating power of dead air spaces. The 8-inch cavity between Jacob's walls wasn't empty waste. It was a carefully engineered thermal buffer that exploited a fundamental property of air. When air is trapped in a confined space and prevented from circulating, it becomes one of nature's most effective insulators. The thermal conductivity of still air is roughly 0.024 W/mK, far lower than wood, 0.12 W/mK, or the mud chinking his neighbors relied on. But Jacob's design went beyond simply trapping air. Those holes he drilled, for near the roofline, for near the foundation, created a controlled convection loop within the wall cavity itself. Cold air entering through the bottom holes would gradually warm as it rose along the inner wall, which radiated heat from the cabin's interior. By the time this air reached the top holes, it had absorbed significant thermal energy, creating a continuous but gentle circulation that distributed warmth throughout the entire wall system without allowing rapid heat loss. The outer wall, meanwhile, bore the brunt of Montana's brutal winds. Wind chill, the accelerated heat loss caused by moving air, devastated conventional single-wall cabins. A 20-mile-per-hour wind could strip heat from exposed logs at a rate 5 times faster than still air. But Jacob's outer wall absorbed this punishment, while the 8-inch air gap prevented wind penetration from ever reaching the structural inner wall. Thomas Bradley, the experienced carpenter who dismissed the design, based his criticism on a fundamental misunderstanding. He assumed the double wall would require heating twice the mass, but thermal mass works differently than structural mass. The outer wall never needed to reach interior temperatures. It simply needed to prevent the inner wall from bleeding heat to the environment. Jacob had also selected his materials with precision that appeared eccentric to observers. The inner wall used white pine, relatively lightweight, with good insulating properties and low thermal conductivity. The outer wall used a mix of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, denser woods that could better withstand weather exposure and physical impact from wind-blown debris. Even his chinking strategy differed between walls. The inner wall received careful treatment with a mixture of clay and dry grass, creating an airtight seal. The outer wall was chinked more loosely, with deliberate gaps that allowed any moisture accumulating in the air cavity to escape, preventing rot and maintaining the dryness essential for the air gap's insulating properties. Dr. Samuel Yates, a physician passing through Bridger Basin in late November, examined the construction with scientific curiosity. Unlike Bradley, Yates recognized elements of insulation theory he'd read about in European engineering journals. It's similar to principles used in German wine cellars, Yates observed, running his hand along the outer wall. Maintaining stable temperatures by buffering against external fluctuations, though I've never seen it applied to residential heating. Will it work? Someone asked. Yates considered the question carefully. In theory, if the airspace remains dry and the walls are properly sealed, it should retain heat far more effectively than conventional construction. Whether the benefit justifies the extra timber and labor. He shrugged. Winter will provide the experiment. Jacob, overhearing this conversation, allowed himself a rare smile. He'd already conducted the experiment. 3 winters in a Harz Mountain hunting cabin his grandfather had built using identical principles. That cabin had remained habitable, with a single small stove, while neighboring structures required massive fireplaces consuming cords of wood. But he didn't share this information. Let them learn through observation. Science required evidence, and evidence was coming. The first test arrived December 8th, when temperatures dropped to 4 below zero with sustained winds of 25 miles per hour, while neighbors huddled close to roaring fires, feeding logs every 30 minutes. Jacob's cabin required wood only twice per evening to maintain a comfortable interior temperature. Bradley, burning through his carefully rationed firewood at an alarming rate, told himself it was a fluke. Maybe Jacob had simply built an unusually airtight door. Maybe his fireplace had exceptional draft. The real test was still ahead. January 14th, 1880. The temperature began falling at sunset. By midnight, Thomas Bradley's exterior thermometer, mounted on the shaded north side of his cabin, away from any residual heat, read 8 below zero. By 2 a.m., it had dropped to 18 below. At 4 a.m., Bradley stopped checking. The mercury had fallen below the lowest mark on his instrument, 25 below zero. A high-pressure system had settled over Montana territory, bringing the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth, that froze spit before it hit the ground, that made exposed metal burn like a brand. Combined with 15-mile-per-hour winds, the effective temperature approached 50 below zero. This was the cold that killed livestock, that froze water buckets solid within an hour, that turned inadequate shelter into a death sentence. If you're thinking this is where Jacob's crazy double wall finally proves itself, or fails spectacularly, hit that like button right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because I'm about to show you the exact temperature measurements that turn skeptics into believers. Drop a comment with your coldest winter temperature on record where you live. Bradley fed his fireplace throughout the night, burning through logs at a rate that made him grateful he'd cut extra wood that fall. Despite the roaring fire, the interior temperature of his cabin, measured 3 feet from the fireplace, hovered around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The corners of the room, 12 feet from the heat source, dropped into the low 40s. Moisture from his breath froze on the interior walls near his bed. He burned 16 logs between midnight and dawn, each approximately 18 inches long and 8 inches in diameter. His hands were raw from carrying wood. His eyes burned from smoke, and he was one of the better prepared homesteaders in the valley. Michael O'Toole, at the trading post, nearly lost 3 fingers when his fireplace couldn't keep pace with heat loss. He wrapped his hands in wool cloth soaked in whiskey and prayed they wouldn't need amputation. 6 cabins in the valley reported interior temperatures below 45 degrees Fahrenheit despite continuous fires. 2 families abandoned their homesteads temporarily, moving in with neighbors whose cabins seemed marginally warmer. And Jacob Reinhardt's cabin? At dawn on January 15th, Thomas Bradley made the trek through knee-deep snow to check on his German neighbor, half expecting to find him frozen or desperately burning furniture. What he found instead changed his understanding of building science forever. Jacob answered the door in his shirt sleeves, no coat, no blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Behind him, the cabin interior radiated gentle warmth. A modest fire burned in the fireplace, but it was smaller than what Bradley had maintained through the night. "Thermometer," Jacob said simply, gesturing to an instrument mounted on his interior wall, positioned away from direct heat. Bradley stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. The warmth wasn't concentrated near the fireplace. It permeated the entire space, gentle and even. The temperature gauge read 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees warmer than Bradley's cabin, during the coldest night of the winter. "How much wood?" Bradley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob led him to the wood box. It was more than half full. 7 logs since midnight, Jacob said. "Same size as yours. Maybe 8 by morning." 7 logs versus Bradley's 16. Less than half the fuel consumption for a temperature 26 degrees higher. Bradley walked to the corner of the cabin, the area that should have been coldest, farthest from the heat source. He held his hand against the inner wall. It was warm to the touch. Not hot, but genuinely warm, as if the entire wall structure itself had become a radiator. "The air space," Jacob explained, anticipating the question. "Warm air from the fire circulates through the cavity holes at the bottom, rises along the inner wall, exits at the top. The heated air transfers warmth to the wall mass throughout the entire structure. Meanwhile, the outer wall blocks wind and cold. The 8-inch gap prevents conduction of cold to the interior." Bradley touched the interior wall again, feeling the steady warmth. It's like the whole cabin is a stove. "Thermal mass with insulation barrier," Jacob corrected gently. "The walls store heat and release it slowly. The air gap prevents that heat from escaping." Through the morning of January 15th, as word spread through the valley, 17 men and 3 women made the journey to Jacob's cabin to verify the reports. Most arrived expecting exaggeration or trickery. All left in silence, their assumptions shattered by empirical reality. The double wall wasn't madness. It was engineering that had survived for generations in harsh climates. Knowledge that American builders had either never learned or had dismissed as unnecessary. By evening, Jacob's cabin had become more than shelter. It had become proof. The cold snap lasted 6 days. By the time temperatures moderated on January 20th, enough homesteaders had visited Jacob's cabin with their own thermometers and measuring tools that a clear picture of comparative performance had emerged, one that couldn't be dismissed as anecdote or luck. Thomas Bradley, humbled but scientifically curious, organized what he called a thermal survey of the valley's cabins. He visited 14 structures of similar size and design, recording interior temperatures at 3 positions, near the heat source, mid-cabin, and in the farthest corner. He also documented wood consumption by counting the number of logs burned during a 12-hour period from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. The results were devastating to conventional wisdom. Single-wall cabins, the standard design used by all homesteaders except Jacob, showed an average interior temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit near the fireplace during sustained sub-zero conditions. Mid-cabin temperatures averaged 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Corner temperatures dropped to an average of 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The variation of 10 degrees within a single room created cold zones where condensation froze on interior walls and bedding required multiple layers of wool blankets. These cabins consumed an average of 14.3 logs per 12-hour period, with several homesteaders burning as many as 18 logs to maintain even these marginal temperatures. Calculating across the full winter heating season, roughly 5 months in Montana, this represented consumption of approximately 715 logs per cabin, requiring advanced cutting and storage of nearly 3 cords of seasoned wood. Jacob's double-wall cabin, measured during the same period under identical weather conditions, maintained 67 degrees Fahrenheit near the fireplace, 65 degrees Fahrenheit mid-cabin, and 63 degrees Fahrenheit in the corners, a variation of only 4 degrees across the entire living space. The even heat distribution eliminated cold zones entirely. Wood consumption, 6.8 logs per 12-hour period. Projected across the full heating season, approximately 340 logs or 1.4 cords of wood. The efficiency difference was staggering. Jacob's design required 52% less fuel to maintain temperatures 15 to 21 degrees higher than conventional construction. Homesteaders burning through their wood supplies at alarming rates saw immediate practical implications. Those 375 logs saved across a winter represented weeks of cutting labor, reduced risk of running short during late-season cold snaps, and preservation of timber resources for other construction needs. But the numbers revealed something even more significant than fuel savings: heat retention over time. Bradley conducted a controlled experiment on January 18th. He allowed fires in both his cabin and Jacob's to burn down to coals simultaneously at 10 p.m., then monitored temperature decline without adding wood. His single-wall cabin dropped from 56 degrees Fahrenheit to 44 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 hours, a loss of 12 degrees. By dawn, the interior temperature had fallen to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above freezing despite residual warmth from the previous evening's fire. Jacob's cabin, starting from 68 degrees Fahrenheit, declined to 61 degrees Fahrenheit over the same 2-hour period, a loss of only 7 degrees. By dawn, the temperature remained at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, still comfortable enough for sleeping without excessive blankets. The thermal mass of the double-wall system, once heated, released stored energy gradually throughout the night. The inner wall, thoroughly warmed by the previous evening's fire, continued radiating heat into the living space for hours after the flames died. The outer wall and air gap prevented this stored heat from escaping to the frigid environment. Dr. Samuel Yates, still in the valley studying a pneumonia outbreak, reviewed Bradley's measurements with professional interest. The principle is sound heat capacity physics, he explained to a group of gathered homesteaders. Wood has a specific heat capacity of approximately 1.7 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. Mr. Reinhardt's double wall contains roughly 40% more wood mass than a single wall of equivalent interior dimension. That additional mass, once heated, stores substantial thermal energy. But shouldn't heating that extra mass require more fuel? Someone asked, the same objection Bradley had raised months earlier. Only initially, Yates replied. The first few fires of winter must heat the thermal mass to operating temperature. But once achieved, the system becomes remarkably efficient. The insulating air gap means that stored heat dissipates very slowly. Each subsequent fire only needs to replace heat lost, not reheat the entire mass. He gestured toward Jacob's cabin. Single-wall construction heats quickly but loses heat equally quickly. High input, high output. This double-wall system heats more slowly initially but retains heat for extended periods. Lower sustained input for stable output. The financial implications rippled through the community immediately. Firewood represented one of the largest labor investments for Montana homesteaders. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking 3 cords of wood required approximately 60 to 80 hours of hard physical labor, typically spread across autumn. Reducing that requirement by half meant 30 to 40 hours reclaimed for other essential tasks. Additional land clearing, livestock care, fence maintenance, hunting, or simply rest during the brief growing season. For families struggling to establish viable homesteads, this time savings could mean the difference between success and failure. By late January 1880, 3 homesteaders had already begun planning double-wall construction for cabins they'd build in the spring. By month's end, that number had grown to 9. Thomas Bradley, the carpenter who'd called the design wasteful, became its most vocal advocate. I was wrong, he told anyone who'd listen. Dead wrong. And I'm man enough to admit it. Spring 1880 brought a quiet revolution to Bridger Basin. As soon as ground thaw permitted foundation work, construction began on 7 new double-wall cabins. Thomas Bradley personally supervised 4 of them, meticulously replicating Jacob's 8-inch air gap and controlled ventilation holes. He charged no premium for his expertise, calling it tuition for education received the hard way. By autumn 1881, 14 double-wall structures stood in the valley. By 1883, the technique had spread to settlements 40 miles north and 30 miles east, carried by travelers who'd experienced the warmth of Jacob's cabin firsthand. Homesteaders called it the Reinhardt design, though Jacob himself insisted the principle was centuries old, just German mountain wisdom my grandfather's grandfather knew. The technique evolved through collective experimentation. Samuel O'Brien, an Irish stonemason, discovered that adding a thin layer of dry moss between the walls improved moisture management without compromising the air gap's insulating properties. Martin Vasquez, from New Mexico Territory, adapted the design using adobe for the outer wall in semi-arid regions where timber was scarce, creating what he called breathing walls that regulated temperature and humidity simultaneously. The performance improvements remained consistent across variations. Double-wall cabins maintained 18 to 28 degree temperature advantages over single-wall construction, with fuel consumption reductions of 45 to 55%. Even crude implementations, rush construction with imperfect air gaps, showed measurable benefits. The winter of 1886 to 87 brought final validation. February temperatures plunged to 38 below zero, with sustained winds creating wind chill conditions approaching 60 below. 2 homesteaders in conventional single-wall cabins suffered severe frostbite. 1 lost 3 toes. Several families burned through their entire winter wood supplies by early March and were forced to burn furniture and fence posts to survive until spring. Not a single double-wall cabin reported serious heating difficulties. Jacob Reinhardt, now 50 years old, burned only 1.2 cords of wood through the entire brutal winter, less than half what he consumed in single-wall shelters during his first Montana years. The technique's success generated broader interest in vernacular building knowledge. A surveyor from Helena, documenting the spread of double-wall construction for a territorial report, noted that immigrant builders bring engineering solutions refined over centuries in harsh climates. American dismissal of these techniques as primitive reveals not their inadequacy, but our ignorance. Jacob himself remained characteristically humble about his role. When a reporter from the Helena Weekly Herald visited in 1889 to write about the man who revolutionized frontier construction, Jacob corrected him immediately. "I revolutionized nothing," he said. "My grandfather built the same way. His grandfather before him. This is not innovation. It's preservation of knowledge that works. But you prove it could work here, in Montana's extreme conditions." Jacob considered this. "I prove that good engineering has no borders. Cold is cold. Physics is physics. Whether in Germany or Montana, trapped air insulates. Dense mass stores heat. These truths don't change with geography." By the time Jacob passed away in 1904 at age 68, double-wall construction had become standard practice in Montana's coldest valleys. Young carpenters learned the technique as fundamental skill, often unaware of the skepticism that had once greeted its pioneer. If this story of dismissed wisdom proving its worth made you think differently about traditional knowledge, and if you want to learn 3 more frontier techniques that modern construction has forgotten, smash that like button and subscribe. I'm dropping a video next week about root cellars that stayed 42 degrees cooler in summer using nothing but earth and geometry. Comment below. What traditional building technique do you wish modern construction would rediscover? Thomas Bradley, who lived until 1911, kept a small wooden plaque in his workshop until his death. It read, "I called him a fool in October. By February, I knew better. Pride is expensive. Wisdom is free once you're willing to learn it." The story of Jacob Reinhardt's double-wall cabin illustrates a pattern repeated throughout frontier history. Techniques dismissed as backward or primitive often embodied sophisticated engineering refined through generations of trial and error. The air gap insulation principle Jacob applied in 1879 wouldn't be invented by American building scientists until the early 20th century, when it was marketed as modern innovation. But it wasn't modern. It was ancient, proven across centuries in climates from the Harz Mountains to the Pyrenees, from Scandinavian forests to Scottish highlands. What changed in Montana wasn't the knowledge itself, but American builders' willingness to recognize that innovation sometimes looks like preservation. The double wall endures today. Several original Reinhardt design cabins still stand in Montana, maintained by historical societies or private owners who appreciate both their heritage value and their continued functionality. When properly maintained, the air gap insulation remains as effective in 2024 as it was in 1880. Proof that good engineering transcends era. Perhaps the deepest lesson isn't about insulation or thermal mass. It's about humility. When neighbors laughed at Jacob's wasted timber and dead airspace, they weren't responding to evidence. They were responding to unfamiliarity. The gap between ignorance and knowledge is often bridged not by explanation, but by experience. Jacob understood this. He didn't argue. He built. And when winter came, the cabin spoke for itself. In the end, 26 degrees of difference proved more persuasive than 1,000 words of defense. Sometimes the best response to skepticism is an argument. It's simply letting the work demonstrate its worth. As Thomas Bradley's plaque acknowledged, wisdom is free, but only once pride steps aside to make room for it.